June 15, 1942. Kubinka Proving Ground, 60 kilometers west of Moscow. The summer air was thick with heat and the faint chemical bite of solvent. In a concrete shed bristling with sandbags and sound baffles, Chief Engineer Nikolai Petrov eased the padded cups of his ear defenders over his temples and raised his left hand. The range officer caught the signal and nodded. On the steel bench, a captured German machine gun lay waiting, its stamped receiver the color of thunderclouds, its barrel jacket perforated like a flute. The weapon had been torn from a position near Stalingrad, tagged, crated, and rushed here with one instruction scrawled in grease pencil across the lid: test immediately. Petrov leaned over the chronograph. The gunner's right hand curled around the pistol grip. The feed tray snapped shut on a belt of 7.92 by 57 millimeter cartridges, their lacquered cases winking in the bare bulb's light. The gunner thumbed the top cover, seated the belt, racked the charging handle, then settled behind the sights. A red lamp on the far wall blinked twice. Petrov exhaled and drove his lifted hand down. The first note was not a bang, but a rip, a high, continuous tearing that substituted for individual shots as if cloth were being pulled forever through serrated steel. In the 5 seconds that followed, 100 brass mouths spat fire and emptied. The muzzle climbed a finger's breadth, settled, climbed again. On the berm 100 meters away, a rectangle of 2 millimeter plate shivered and whitened, the paint erased in a single gray blur. The shed filled with a metallic rain of ejected cases, a staccato hail that drowned the ticking of Petrov's stopwatch. He looked down anyway. 5 seconds. He looked up at the mounting pile of brass pooling around the gunner's elbows. He ran the arithmetic the way he had since he was a boy, fast and neat and without mercy. 1,200 rounds per minute, triple the rate of their water-cooled Maxim, the old horse that had dragged itself from the trenches of 1916 into this new war. Faithful, but slow. His mouth went dry. He signaled safe. The ripping stopped, and in its absence the shed felt cavernous and fragile, the silence deeper than the noise that had carved it. The gun smoked faintly. He could smell singed oil and the sour ghost of propellant. The gunner cracked the top cover and lifted the belt. The linkages were warm to the touch. Petrov touched the barrel latch with a gloved finger and felt the designed ease of the changeover, a clever little door that promised a new tube in seconds rather than minutes. He had stripped German weapons before, admired their tolerances, cursed their vanity. This was different. This was not vanity. This was a philosophy of fire. He scribbled the figure in his notebook and underlined it twice. Maschinengewehr 42, MG42. He wrote the number again, slower, as if the shape of it might change if given time. He noted the short recoil action, the roller-locked bolt, the stamped receiver that explained the weight in his hands and the ease of manufacture his factories could not yet match. He remembered the weight of a Maxim on a winter road, the way 2 men and a horse argued with a sledge while the barrel jacket steamed like a samovar. He looked again at the German barrel door, the quick hinge, the way the design begged to be run hot and changed often. The Germans had not built a gun. They had built a furnace. Outside, a summer thunderhead rolled low over the birches. Somewhere beyond the trees, a freight train moaned east, hauling steel and wheat and men. Petrov closed his notebook and felt in his chest the twin weights of fear and recognition. There was a sound a soldier never forgot. The Maxim spoke in syllables. This spoke in a single sentence that never ended. He imagined a squad advancing into that sentence and felt the human math rearrange itself. 1 gun to freeze a platoon. 3 to turn ground into a wordless order to die. He lifted his head and found his assistant staring at him, eyes wide above the muffs. "This is not an ordinary machine gun," Petrov said, voice low, half to the boy and half to the room. "This is a saw." He wrote one last line beneath the figures. "If every German squad is built around this, then our arithmetic of courage must change." By late summer 1942, the Soviet Union had become an anvil hammered from all sides. From the Arctic Circle to the Caucasus, artillery fire drew a red line across 3,000 kilometers of steppe. The factories beyond the Urals groaned 24 hours a day, pressing the air with the smell of oil and hot steel. Inside that storm, the Kubinka test field became a kind of whispering chamber where the Red Army tried to understand the mind of its enemy through captured machines. Every week, crates arrived from the front. Panzer sights packed in straw, unexploded shells, twisted receivers. The engineers unbolted, measured, copied, and speculated, hoping that comprehension might equal defense. The MG42 lay among those relics like something from another age. Petrov's report, sent up the chain through the main artillery directorate, traveled all the way to the Kremlin. Stalin's aides underlined one phrase twice: 1 MG42 equals 3 Maxims. It was not simply an engineering note, it was an accusation against the slow, water-cooled comfort of the past. The Maxim PM 1910, with its curved brass jacket and horse-drawn carriage, had fought the Tsar's wars and the revolutions too. It was heavy, dependable, and by 1942, an artifact. The German gun weighed half as much, fired twice as fast, and could be built in a tenth of the time. Where the Maxim hissed and clanked like a locomotive, the MG42 shrieked like a sawmill. At Kubinka, Petrov's team repeated the tests for verification. They fired the captured weapon until the barrel glowed cherry red, then swapped it for another in 6 seconds flat. The engineers timed the sequence, wrote in pencil margins, "No need for cooling water, only air and courage." They compared blueprints, Soviet drawings traced in neat Cyrillic beside German originals filled with Gothic precision, and realized that the Germans had traded craftsmanship for cleverness. Instead of machined receivers, they used stamped steel, pressed by dies the Soviet Union did not yet possess. Petrov watched one of his apprentices hold up a German feed tray and laugh softly. It was thinner than a mess tin, yet ran flawlessly. The data spread through the technical journals marked "for internal use only." Commanders at Stalingrad began receiving whispered advice. Expect new machine guns with continuous sound. Do not expose troops in open ground. Chuikov, commanding the 62nd Army, later wrote that the MG42's voice was the most feared sound on the Volga. The weapon's 1/200 round per minute rate blurred individual shots into a single metallic roar. Soviet soldiers called it the linen ripper. To them it felt less like being shot at than being erased. Petrov's curiosity turned uneasy. He understood that an army which could produce such weapons might already think differently about war. The Germans built their infantry squads around the gun itself, the riflemen serving as feeders and carriers for belts of ammunition. Doctrine had become geometry, each squad a circle around a single point of fire. The Red Army still thought of its machine guns as support, not as center. Petrov wrote in a margin, not without admiration, "Their machine gunners command, ours obey." The comparison tests deepened his anxiety. The MG42's barrel survived 1,500 rounds before accuracy drifted. The Maxim's water jacket boiled after 600. The German belts fed without hesitation. Soviet canvas links twisted and snagged. Petrov's assistant recorded the misfeeds, each one an audible pause, each pause a death on a battlefield measured in seconds. The chief engineer did not curse the men who built the Maxim. He had used one himself in Finland and loved its weight, its reliability. But he felt the gap between centuries widening. At night, he walked the perimeter of the test ground, the pines whispering under a thin crescent moon, and thought of the soldiers who would meet this new weapon first. His notes that week carried fewer numbers and more fragments of unease. The MG42 consumes ammunition like fire consumes air. The limiting factor is not metal, but logistics. Without infinite bullets, even this perfection will choke. He was right. The Germans were learning the same lesson in reverse. The more devastating their weapon, the faster their supply chains bled. For every minute of sustained fire, 1,200 cartridges vanished. Multiply that by a division, and you could hear factories groan 3 countries away. War, Petrov realized, was an argument between physics and industry, not merely bravery. When his final report reached Moscow, it carried one suggestion in careful ink: we must learn from this gun without worshiping it. Replace our Maxim with something lighter, faster, but built from what our factories can bear. Out of those words would grow the SG-43 Goryunov, slower than the MG-42 but sturdy and simple, a weapon of compromise and necessity. The engineers filed the MG-42 in the archive with its bolt face polished clean, its serial number noted in triplicate. Yet the sound it made that first day never quite left them. It haunted the corridors of Tula and Izhevsk, the conversations over tea, the talk in the drafting rooms. It was a sound that belonged to the future, to wars still waiting to be born. Winter came early to the steppe that year, and with it, the sound that Petrov had tried to describe in his reports. The thin, uninterrupted scream of the MG-42. By November, the frozen ground around Stalingrad vibrated with it. Infantrymen wrote that the air itself seemed to shred when the German guns opened up. The Red Army had expected the chatter of the old MG-34s or the slower bark of the Maxims. Instead, they heard a continuous roar that came and went before they could breathe twice. In the bunkers along the Volga, Soviet soldiers learned to read the weapon's rhythm. The rip was too fast to count, too even to dodge. They learned to move only after the sound paused for breath, the half-second it took to swap belts or barrels. Men who survived spoke later of lying in shell holes, feeling the air tremble around them, tasting rust in their mouths from the spray of pulverized soil. At Kubinka, Petrov followed every field report. He marked each one on a wall map with thin black pins, each pin a place where the MG-42 had been confirmed in use. He and his engineers stayed through the winter, dissecting guns salvaged from the ruins of captured positions. Every recovered weapon told the same story: precision-stamped parts, clean welds, no wasted metal. It was the embodiment of industrial confidence, the thing the Soviet factories were still struggling to achieve. Inside the city, Colonel Vasily Chuikov's staff tried to find ways to counter it. Snipers were ordered to aim for the gun crews, not the guns. Mortars were trained to drop shells on the sound alone, judging position by the echo that carried across the river. Some units began calling for artillery before they attacked. smothering the German positions in smoke and dust so that the buzz saws could not see their targets. Still, the psychological toll was heavy. A Maxim gunner, his hands blistered from the heat of his water jacket, wrote home that he had never feared metal until he met this weapon. The gun speaks faster than thought. It doesn't shoot, it eats. By early 1943, Petrov's department received orders from the People's Commissariat of Armaments to copy the German design. The Tula arsenal set up a special line under the code name Kopierowanie, replication. Petrov rode the train there through nights of blackout and frost, carrying his notebooks and the last intact German receiver. In the workshops, he saw the limits of his own country in the dull glow of the forge. The presses could not stamp steel with the precision the German dies achieved. The rollers warped. The metal cracked under stress. Out of 47 prototypes built, half failed before the fifth belt. One burst its barrel with a sound like a struck bell. He reported the failures without apology. "Our steel cannot breathe fast enough," he told the ministry envoy who visited in March. "This design needs lungs we do not yet have." Instead, he proposed a simpler path. Streamline the Maxim's heavy frame, switch to air cooling, remove the water jacket. The result, after months of sketches and tests, would be the SG-43 Goryunov, slower but honest to the tools that made it. While the engineers worked, the war outside consumed men by the tens of thousands. The MG42's legend grew. At Kursk, in July 1943, a single German strongpoint armed with 3 guns held off an entire Soviet battalion for half an hour. 15,000 rounds poured through the barrels. When the Russians finally overran the trench, they found the guns blistered and still warm, the sand fused to the steel. The German crews were dead from concussion, their hands welded to the grips. Yet the damage was done. 127 killed, 200 wounded. The assault delayed long enough for tanks to reposition. Petrov read the after-action reports with a kind of detached grief. He respected the German engineers, their precision, their logic, but he also saw the flaw written in the figures. 1,200 rounds a minute meant 1,200 cartridges, each weighing 25 grams, 30 kilograms of ammunition every minute for each gun. Logistics, not bravery, would strangle them. The Red Army could lose a gunner and replace him by nightfall. The Wehrmacht could lose ammunition and replace it only by miracle. In late 1943, when the first SG-43s left the factory floor, Petrov stood at the test range again. The new weapon barked instead of screamed, 600 rounds per minute, a tempo a man could follow. It was not beautiful, but it was theirs. Watching the test gunner feed the belt, Petrov realized that sometimes survival was not about surpassing the enemy, but outlasting him. He sent his final memorandum that winter, a single page attached to a bundle of test sheets. The German weapon teaches us that speed alone does not win wars. The Maxim was too slow, the MG42 too fast. Victory belongs to those whose weapons fit their factories, whose factories fit their soil. Outside, snow hissed on the iron roofs of Tula, and the sound reminded him faintly of that first burst in Kubinka, the sound that had terrified him, the sound that had changed how an army thought about fire. In the spring of 1944, Petrov finally left the test ground and traveled south. His superiors wanted him to observe the MG42 not in theory, but in flesh and blood, how it sounded, how it killed, and how men behaved in its presence. He was attached to a frontline repair detachment outside Kharkov, where the snow was thinning into mud and the smell of thaw mixed with gun oil. The first time he heard the gun in combat, he felt it in his ribs before he understood what it was. A ripple of sound, high and seamless, sliced across the fields and then stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The infantry ahead of him dropped flat as if struck by wind. The silence afterward was worse. It was a silence that measured who was still breathing. He realized that the figures on his reports, the neat calculations of rounds per minute, were nothing beside this raw physics of terror. That night, he sat with a company of riflemen in a ruined farmhouse. The youngest of them, a boy no older than his own son, was cleaning a captured MG42 balanced across his knees. The metal gleamed even in the candlelight, its receiver dented but functional. The boy looked up when he saw Petrov's shoulder tabs. "Is it true, comrade engineer," he asked, "that this gun fires 1,200 shots in a minute?" Petrov nodded. The boy smiled thinly. "Then a man has half a heartbeat to live when it starts." The gun had been seized in close quarters when the Germans withdrew. The squad leader, Sergeant Kovalenko, poured tea into a chipped mug and told Petrov what he had seen. "We thought it was witchcraft," he said. "The first burst cut down half the platoon, but when we got close, we found the barrel glowing like a lamp. The gunner couldn't change it fast enough. He had 3 more barrels, all melted." Kovalenko ran his thumb along the edge of the receiver. "You can make a weapon too perfect, you know. It eats its own strength." Petrov asked permission to examine the weapon. He ran his fingers over the stamped parts, felt the burrs from mass production. He thought of the German engineer, Werner Gruner, whose name he had read in the intelligence reports, a man he would never meet, but whose mind he could recognize in the geometry of the gun. Somewhere, Gruner had drawn these curves, calculated these tolerances, believing he was giving precision to his army. Petrov wondered if the man ever thought about what happened when the blueprint met the body. At dawn, the detachment moved to a forward position near Poltava. Petrov stayed behind to oversee the repair of captured weapons. For 2 weeks, he watched soldiers bring him guns half destroyed, some German, some Soviet, all scarred by the same heat. He noticed how the men spoke about the MG42, with hatred, yes, but also with a grudging awe. One night, a wounded German prisoner was brought in under guard, his arm bandaged in rough linen. When the sentry stepped away, Petrov knelt beside him and asked, in halting German, "You were a machine gunner?" The man nodded. His face was gray with exhaustion. "It was beautiful," he whispered, "too beautiful." For a long time, Petrov said nothing. Then he told the man, "We have beautiful machines too. They just run slower." The prisoner smiled, a thin line of teeth. "Then you will win," he said, "because you have time." That exchange stayed with Petrov long after the front moved west. He returned to Moscow with notebooks full of sketches and a single idea forming in the margins, that technology was only as merciful as the men who built it. The MG42 had shown him the edge where engineering crossed into fear, where speed turned from advantage into appetite. He began lecturing younger designers at Tula about restraint. "The German gun teaches us that perfection without empathy is ruin," he told them. "Design as if you will hold the barrel yourself." Many of them nodded, but some looked at him as though he had grown sentimental. The war had little room for sentiment, yet by 1945, as Berlin burned, Petrov's words seemed less foolish. The Germans' finest machine gun had not saved them. Their factories had run empty before their courage did. After the surrender, Petrov was invited to examine captured documents in Dresden. In a half-collapsed office, he found Gruner's signature on a set of blueprints dated 1941. The curves were elegant, the tolerances meticulous. In the corner, in a neat engineer's hand, someone had written schneller, einfacher, billiger, faster, simpler, cheaper. Petrov stared at the words until the paper blurred. The war had followed that command to its end. He folded the sheet, placed it back on the desk, and stepped outside. The city smelled of wet ash and lilac. In the rubble, he could hear hammers already tapping, a rhythm that did not sound like gunfire, but like rebuilding. For the first time in years, the silence did not frighten him. May 1945. Berlin had fallen, and with it, the empire that had built the gun which once roared like a saw. The streets were thick with dust, the smell of cordite and burned paper rising from the cellars. Soviet columns moved through the city's bones in silence now, the fighting finished, but the habit of caution still in their muscles. Petrov arrived 3 weeks after the guns went quiet. He walked through a factory on the outskirts of Spandau, where MG42 receivers lay stacked in crates. The machines that had stamped them, massive presses with cracked gears, were frozen mid-motion, their dies still slick with the oil of production. He ran a hand over the cold metal and felt a strange mixture of triumph and pity. In one corner of the floor stood a chalkboard covered with numbers, serial runs, tolerances, projected output. The last date read April 17, 1945. Below it, a note in German, Kein Stahl mehr, no more steel. The war had ended not because one side became weaker in courage, but because the earth itself had been mined to exhaustion. Petrov's escort, a young captain who had survived Stalingrad, laughed without humor. "So this is the monster," he said, nudging one of the guns with his boot. "We feared it like thunder." Petrov knelt and picked up a single cartridge left on the floor. The brass was tarnished, the primer struck, but unspent. "Thunder ends," he said quietly. "The rain stays." He pocketed the cartridge, not as a souvenir, but as a reminder of what sound could do to a man's heart. Across Germany, Soviet depots overflowed with captured MG42s. Thousands were shipped east for study. Thousands more were melted down. Some units kept a few to use until their barrels wore smooth. Others locked them away, uncomfortable with their efficiency. The Red Army had its own weapons now, the SG-43, the DSHK, soon the PK. Yet whenever veterans heard a high, continuous tearing sound, sometimes a train coupling, sometimes a plane's propeller, they flinched. Memory outlasted steel. Petrov returned to Moscow in the summer. The city was draped in banners, victory songs echoing from loudspeakers, but he felt only a deep fatigue. His wife met him at the station. She had grown thin, her hair silvered by the years of absence. That night, he sat at their kitchen table and opened his notebook. The pages smelled faintly of oil and smoke. He wrote his last entry. The German gun was faster. Ours were heavier. In the end, neither mattered. The war belonged to those who endured. He retired from service a year later and took a post teaching young engineers. He brought to class a bent fragment of a receiver and the brass cartridge he had kept. He would place them on the desk and begin every lecture the same way. "Every design you draw will live longer than you do. Make sure it deserves to." The students listened because his voice carried the certainty of someone who had measured horror with calipers. In the decades that followed, the MG42 refused to die. Western Germany renamed it the MG3, chambered it for NATO ammunition, and built it anew. Its descendants traveled to Africa, to Asia, to the Middle East, anywhere men still believed speed could solve fear. Petrov read about these things in the papers and felt an old weariness settle over him. His own country had gone on to design the PKM, a gun that borrowed lessons from both the Maxim and the German saw. The circle had closed. In 1961, on the 20th anniversary of the MG42's birth, Petrov visited the Kubinka range once more. The test fields were overgrown, the bunkers half collapsed. He found the firing shed where it had all begun, its roof rusted through but still standing. On the wall, faint under decades of dust, his old chalk marks remained, 100 rounds per minute. He traced the numbers with a fingertip and listened to the wind rush through the open doorway. For an instant, it sounded like that first burst, then only like wind again. He smiled, small and tired. "You taught us well," he said to the empty air. "You taught us to be afraid and to think." He left the cartridge on the bench before he walked away. Years passed. The war that had once swallowed half the planet receded into film reels and parades, into stories told by men with medals and trembling hands. Yet for those who had seen the MG42's fury, or felt it, its echo remained alive in muscle memory. Petrov grew older. His lectures became quieter, his hands less steady when he held a slide rule. But whenever students asked him what victory had meant, his eyes grew distant, and he would begin to speak about noise and silence. He explained that every war invents a sound that defines it. The Great War had the slow heartbeat of the Maxim gun, each burst like the tick of an iron clock. The Second World War had the MG42, a single, continuous scream. It was a sound without intervals, without mercy, the sound of a century learning to kill by automation. When the gunfire becomes music, he told them, the listener is already lost. After retirement, he lived in a small apartment outside Moscow. The brass cartridge from Berlin sat in a glass case beside a photograph of his wife. Sometimes he would walk through the courtyard where neighborhood children played with wooden rifles, shouting rat-tat-tat-tat and falling in mock death. He never scolded them, he only listened. The imitation of gunfire had become a game, its terror dissolved into rhythm. Perhaps that was how peace survived, by forgetting the texture of fear. In 1971, he received an invitation from East Germany. The new government was restoring the old Grossfuss factory where the MG42 had been born, turning it into a museum of labor. They asked Petrov to attend as a visiting engineer, one of those who had once studied their captured weapon. He hesitated for weeks before accepting. On the flight to Dresden, he carried no luggage but a notebook and a single page torn from his original report. The museum was bright, sterilized, its halls lined with cutaway models and placards that spoke of metallurgy and innovation, but not of men. In a glass case, an MG42 stood polished to mirror shine, its feed cover open like a mouth about to speak. Petrov stared at it for a long time. The curator, a young German woman, asked softly, "It was a terrible weapon, wasn't it?" He nodded. "Terrible," he said, "and perfect?" She frowned, unsure if it was condemnation or praise. He added, "But even perfection serves something. That is what frightens me most." He left the museum before the ceremony ended. Outside, the air smelled of coal smoke and spring rain. Along the river, workers were rebuilding a bridge destroyed 30 years before. The clang of their hammers came at steady intervals, slow and human. For the first time, he felt the rhythm as something kind, a reminder that not every sound made by metal had to wound. When he returned home, he placed the torn page of his old report on his desk and wrote beneath it, "The gun taught us the limits of speed and the need for mercy in design." He closed the notebook and never opened it again. Petrov died in 1974. His students carried his notebooks to the archives of the Central Museum of the Armed Forces, where they rest among diagrams of tanks and engines. One visitor years later found a note tucked between two pages. "Victory is the art of learning from what terrified you." The handwriting was his. Today, the MG42's lineage lives on in the MG3 on NATO's tripods, in the PKM that still patrols the world's borders, in the hum of every automatic weapon designed for efficiency. The engineers who build them seldom think of the man at Kubinka who listened to a 5-second burst and heard the future rushing toward him. But in every factory, in every drawing of a breech and bolt, his unspoken warning lingers that speed and reason without compassion become their own kind of war. The fields at Kubinka are quiet now. Grass grows through the concrete and wildflowers bloom around the rusted rails. On certain windy days, locals say you can hear a faint, tearing sound from the direction of the old firing shed. Just the wind, they insist, threading through the empty walls. But to those who know the story, it sounds like history breathing, a whisper that reminds us how close invention and destruction have always been. And you, where are you hearing it from tonight? At your desk, on your way home, somewhere safe? If you listen closely, beyond the hum of your own machines, you may still catch that echo, the sound of a weapon that fired 1,200 rounds a minute, and of a man who learned too late that silence is the greatest invention of all.